To the old lady who's going to be replaced soon, Ashley said, lifting her glass just high enough for everyone to see, her smile polished, her voice light, almost playful, as if the words didn't carry weight, as if they weren't meant to land exactly where they did, right in the center of my chest, right in front of my grandson, my son, and every guest I had helped gather around that table. There was a pause after she said it, a thin, fragile silence that stretched across the room like a crack in glass, and I noticed how no one laughed the way they were supposed to. Only a few awkward chuckles slipping out before dying too quickly, and I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my back straight, my face calm, because I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in a moment like that is react too soon. I picked up my water glass instead, took a small sip, and let my eyes move slowly across the table, not searching for comfort, not expecting defense, just observing, collecting, the way you do when something finally confirms what you've been quietly suspecting for months. My grandson kept playing with his napkin. Unaware, my son avoided my gaze, focusing instead on cutting a piece of steak that didn't need cutting, and Ashley, she lowered her glass with that same soft smile, already turning the moment into something dismissible, something deniable, like a joke that only I had misunderstood, but I didn't misunderstand, not this time, because in that single sentence, wrapped in politeness and delivered like a toast, she had said everything she'd been working toward, everything she thought she had already secured. I remember thinking, very clearly, very quietly, that this wasn't carelessness, it wasn't cruelty by accident, it was timing, it was intention, it was a message delivered in public, so there would be witnesses, so there would be pressure, so there would be no easy way for me to respond without looking exactly like what she wanted me to look like. So I didn't respond. I adjusted the edge of my sleeve, smoothed the fabric over my wrist, and allowed the moment to pass as if it hadn't carved something permanent into the air between us, because I understood something then that made everything else fall into place. Every missed call, every document I was told not to worry about, every small decision made without me, every polite exclusion disguised as convenience. This lunch, this table, this carefully arranged afternoon that I had helped pay for, plan for, believe in, it wasn't a celebration for my grandson, not entirely. It was a stage, and I had just been introduced as someone whose role was ending. I let out a slow breath, barely noticeable, and set my glass down with care, because the truth was, while Ashley thought she had chosen the perfect moment to reveal her hand, she didn't realize that I had already seen the game, and more importantly, I had already made my move long before she ever raised that glass. I had learned to listen to what people did not say just as carefully as what they did, and in that room, the silence after her words spoke louder than anything else that afternoon, because no one corrected her, no one laughed it off properly, and most importantly, no one looked surprised, which told me more than any confession ever could. I kept my posture steady, my shoulders relaxed, but inside, I began placing each piece exactly where it belonged, like I had done many times before in my life. When things did not feel right, but I had chosen patience over confrontation. Ashley reached for the wine bottle and poured herself another glass, her movements smooth and practiced, as if she had rehearsed not just the words but the entire rhythm of this moment, and I noticed how she did not once glance in my direction again, as though I had already been dismissed, already reduced to something temporary. My son cleared his throat, said something about the cake coming soon, something light, something meaningless, and I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with a quiet recognition that distance had been growing long before today, distance that had been explained away with busy schedules, with work, with life, all the usual reasons that sound reasonable until they are not. I remembered the email I was never copied on about refinancing the house, the one I only discovered because a bank representative accidentally called me instead of Ashley, assuming I was still involved in decisions that once had my name attached to them. I remembered the afternoon I was told not to worry about property taxes anymore, because they had it handled, even though for 20 years I had been the one writing those checks every April without fail. Small things, each one easy to dismiss on its own, each one polite, almost considerate, but together they formed something else entirely, something deliberate. I reached for my napkin again, folding it once more even though it was already perfectly placed, just to give my hands something to do while my mind continued its quiet work, and I realized that what Ashley had done was not impulsive. It was not even emotional. It was strategic, a public statement designed to normalize an idea before it officially happened, to introduce the concept that I was no longer essential, that I was already on my way out. I let my gaze drift toward the window where the late afternoon light fell softly across the table, illuminating the decorations I had chosen myself just 2 days earlier, blue and silver balloons, a cake from the bakery my grandson loved, details that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's celebration, not mine, not anymore. But what Ashley did not understand, what none of them understood, was that I had stopped being unaware a long time ago. I had simply chosen not to interrupt them while they revealed how far they were willing to go, because there is a certain clarity that only comes when you let people believe you are not paying attention. Weeks before this lunch, I had sat in a quiet office across from a man who listened carefully without interrupting, a man who asked precise questions and took notes without judgment. And when I left that office, nothing had visibly changed, not in my routine, not in my behavior, not in the way I showed up to family dinners or answered phone calls, but something had shifted permanently beneath the surface. I returned my attention to the table just as Ashley laughed at something someone said, her voice bright again, the tension dissolving for everyone except me, and I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to settle on my face, not because I found anything amusing, but because I finally understood that the moment she chose to reveal her intention was also the moment she lost control of the outcome. And that was something she would not realize until it was far too late. I let the afternoon continue as if nothing had shifted, as if the air had not already changed its weight. And when the cake was finally brought out, I was the first one to stand, the first one to clap, the first one to lean in and straighten the candles so they stood perfectly upright for my grandson. Because there are moments in life when maintaining grace is not about denial, it is about control. And I had no intention of surrendering that. The room filled with a softer energy then, something easier, something more comfortable for everyone else. And I noticed how quickly people adjusted when given permission to pretend everything was fine, how easily they slipped back into laughter once the tension was no longer acknowledged. I watched Ashley from across the table as she pulled out her phone, angling it just right to capture the moment, her smile wide, her voice warm as she guided my grandson to make a wish. And I wondered briefly if she even remembered what she had said minutes earlier, or if, to her, it had already served its purpose and no longer needed to exist. I stepped back slightly, giving them space in the frame, a quiet instinct I had developed over the years, to move just enough to be present but not central. And as I did, I felt something settle inside me, something firm and unshakable, not anger, not sadness, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping people will be better than they have shown you they are. My son glanced at me once, quickly, almost nervously, as if he wanted to say something but did not know how, and I met his eyes with the same calm expression I had worn all afternoon, offering him nothing to hold on to, no reaction to ease his conscience, no confrontation to force his defense, just silence, which is often the most honest mirror. After the candles were blown out and the applause faded, I returned to my seat and reached for my purse, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just with intention, because I knew exactly what was inside and why I had brought it with me today. The envelope rested there, untouched, its edges still crisp, its contents unchanged since the morning I placed them there after reviewing them one final time at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once planned holidays, birthdays, and every family gathering that used to feel different, that used to mean something else. I did not take the envelope out. Not yet, because timing, I had learned, is everything. And revealing something too early can be just as ineffective as revealing it too late. Instead, I closed my purse again and folded my hands over it, letting the weight of what I carried ground me in the present moment while the conversation around me drifted into ordinary topics, school schedules, weekend plans. Things that sounded harmless, but now felt strangely distant, like a language I no longer needed to speak. Ashley began discussing an upcoming renovation, casually mentioning decisions that had already been made, contractors already chosen, timelines already set, and I listened without interrupting, noting how my name did not appear in any part of that future she described, not as a participant, not even as a consideration, and that absence, spoken so casually, confirmed everything her earlier words had implied. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her plans, and allowed a faint smile. To return, not for her, not for them, but for myself, because in that moment, surrounded by voices that no longer included me, I understood something they did not, something they could not see yet, and that was the simple fact that while they had been quietly rewriting my place in their lives, I had already begun rewriting the terms entirely, and unlike them, I had not done it in pieces, I had done it all at once. The conversation around the table continued to drift in comfortable circles, but I had already stepped outside of it in a way no one could see. And as Ashley spoke about paint colors and kitchen layouts, I found myself remembering a very different afternoon just 3 weeks earlier, one that had taken place in a quiet office building on the other side of town, where the air smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee, and where every word spoken had been measured, recorded, and impossible to take back. I had arrived 10 minutes early that day, as I always do, sitting with my hands folded in my lap just as they were now. Except then there had been no noise around me, no distractions, only the steady ticking of a clock on the wall and the sound of my own breathing as I waited to be called in. When the door finally opened, the man who greeted me did not smile in the way people do out of politeness. His expression was neutral, attentive, the kind that told me he was used to listening to things most people preferred to avoid, and I appreciated that more than warmth. I remember placing a folder on his desk, one I had spent several evenings organizing, each document aligned, each page marked, not because I enjoy order, but because clarity requires precision, and I had reached a point in my life where I no longer wanted to guess about anything that carried my name. He asked me simple questions at first, about the house, about the accounts, about how long certain arrangements had been in place, and I answered without hesitation, because the answers had been forming long before I walked into that room. What surprised him, I think, was not the information itself, but the calm way I delivered it, as if I were discussing someone else's life rather than my own. And perhaps in a way, I was, because the version of me that had trusted without question, that had assumed loyalty where none had been proven, was already beginning to feel like a memory I no longer needed to carry. I told him about the small changes I had noticed, the decisions made without me, the documents that no longer arrived, the subtle shift in tone when my presence was discussed rather than assumed. And he listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally making a note, never once dismissing what others might have called overthinking or sensitivity. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and asked a single question, one that stayed with me long after I left his office. He asked, "What outcome would make you feel secure, not just today, but 5 years from now?" And I did not answer immediately, because for the first time, I was not thinking about maintaining peace or preserving appearances. I was thinking about permanence, about control, about ensuring that no one could quietly remove me from something I had spent a lifetime building. The answer, when it came, was simple and once spoken. It could not be undone. I returned to the present as Ashley laughed again, her voice cutting lightly through the room, and I realized how different that office had felt compared to this table, how in one place every word had carried weight, and in the other, words were used to disguise intention, to soften edges that were anything but soft. I rested my hand gently over my purse again, feeling the outline of the envelope beneath the leather, and I allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, not hesitation, not doubt, just acknowledgement, because everything that was happening now had already been accounted for, already considered, already answered in a room where no one laughed things off and nothing was left undefined. And as I looked up once more at the people around me, I understood with quiet certainty that while they believed this afternoon marked the beginning of my exit, it was in fact the final moment before everything shifted in a direction they had not prepared for. Natural it seemed to him now, how easily he occupied a version of life where I was no longer central, where my role had been reduced to presence without influence, appearance without authority. I reached for my glass again, not because I needed another sip, but because the movement gave me a moment to observe without being observed, and in that reflection along the surface of the water, I saw something I had not allowed myself to fully accept until now, that this had not happened suddenly. It had been built slowly, carefully, piece by piece, until the final picture looked complete enough for them to reveal it. I set the glass down gently and let my fingers rest against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my touch, grounding myself in something real while everything else around me felt curated, staged, intentional. Someone asked Ashley a question about permits, and she answered confidently, mentioning figures, square footage, estimated timelines, details that required access that I knew had once been tied directly to me. And that confirmation settled something inside me with absolute clarity, because it meant that what I had prepared for was not just possible, it was necessary. I glanced briefly toward my grandson, who was now focused on unwrapping a gift, his small hands working carefully at the ribbon, completely unaware of the quiet negotiations unfolding around him. And I felt a familiar softness rise in me, not enough to weaken my resolve, but enough to remind me why I had tolerated uncertainty for as long as I had, why I had waited instead of reacting, because protecting moments like his had always mattered more to me than protecting my pride. But there comes a point when silence stops being protection and starts becoming permission, and I had reached that point long before today. Ashley laughed again, lighter now, more relaxed, as if the earlier tension had dissolved completely, and she leaned slightly toward my son, placing her hand over his in a gesture that looked natural, effortless, reinforcing something that no longer needed to be stated aloud. And I watched that interaction with the same calm detachment I had carried all afternoon, because what I felt now was not surprise, not even disappointment, but recognition, the kind that sharpens rather than wounds. I opened my purse once more, this time allowing my fingers to rest on the edge of the envelope for just a second longer, feeling the firmness of it, the finality of what it contained. And I thought about the moment in that office when everything had been signed, when every detail had been confirmed, when there had been no room left for interpretation or, for the first time, how much of that confidence came from assumption rather than certainty. My son followed her into the kitchen for a moment, their voices lowering just enough to become indistinct, but not enough to disappear completely, and I did not need to hear the words to understand the tone, the rhythm, the quiet alignment that had formed between them long before today. I remained seated, my posture unchanged, my presence steady, as if I had nowhere else to be, because in truth, I did. Not yet. Not until everything that needed to unfold had done so in its proper time. I reached for my purse again, this time not just touching the envelope, but sliding it slightly closer to the opening, a small adjustment, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to me it marked a shift from preparation to readiness. I thought about the final conversation I had in that office, the way the man had looked at me after reviewing everything one last time, his tone measured as he explained what would happen once certain documents were presented, how the sequence mattered, how timing would determine not just the outcome, but the impact. And I had listened carefully, asking only one question before leaving, not about legality, not about process, but about certainty. And his answer had been simple. Once this is in motion, it cannot be undone. And I had nodded, because that was exactly what I wanted. Ashley returned to the table with a light smile, placing a plate down, resuming her place as if nothing had ever been disrupted. And I noticed how she avoided looking directly at me now, just slightly, just enough to suggest that somewhere beneath her confidence, there was the beginning of awareness, the faint recognition that something had not gone exactly as expected. I allowed the silence between us to exist without filling it, because silence has a way of expanding when it is not interrupted. And in that space, people begin to question their own certainty. My son sat back, down, picking up his fork again out of habit rather than need. And for a moment, everything appeared normal, so completely ordinary that it almost felt convincing. But I knew better, because normal is often just the surface people agree to maintain until something forces it to break. I placed my hands gently on the table, fingers relaxed, and let my gaze settle calmly ahead, not on any one person, but on the space itself, the room that held all of us, all of our assumptions, all of our unspoken intentions. And I realized that this was the moment, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything had already happened, quietly, deliberately, long before we sat down together. I opened my purse once more, this time without hesitation, and rested my hand on the envelope, Not removing it yet, just letting it be visible enough that it could exist in the edge of someone's awareness if they happen to look closely. Because sometimes the most powerful shift begins not with a declaration, but with a presence, something introduced into the space that was not there before. Something that changes the balance without a single word being spoken. Ashley glanced up then, her eyes catching that small detail for just a fraction of a second. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, the first crack in her certainty, the brief flicker of a question she could not yet form. And I held that moment gently, without pushing it, without rushing it, because I had waited this long not to react, but to arrive. And now that I was here, I intended to let everything unfold exactly as it was meant to, one quiet, irreversible step at a time. I let the silence linger just long enough to settle into the corners of the room, just long enough for that small shift in awareness to begin spreading quietly from one person to another, because once something changes in the atmosphere, even slightly, people feel it before they understand it. Ashley adjusted her posture, her smile returning, but not quite as steady as before. Her eyes flicking once more toward my purse, and then quickly away, as if acknowledging it directly would give it more meaning than she was ready to accept, and I remained still, allowing that unspoken question to grow on its own. My son reached for his glass, took a sip, and set it down with a little more care than necessary, the kind of movement that reveals tension without naming it, and I noticed how his attention had shifted, how he was no longer fully engaged in the casual conversation happening around him, but instead caught somewhere between curiosity and hesitation, trying to understand what had changed without asking. I placed my hand gently on the table again, leaving my purse slightly open now, the edge of the envelope visible, not presented, not announced, simply present. And that was enough, because presence alone can alter the direction of a room when the timing is right. I thought briefly about the exact moment everything had been finalized, the quiet sound of a pen against paper, the steady confirmation that every detail had been secured, and how ordinary it had felt at the time, almost anticlimactic, because true decisions rarely arrive with noise, they arrive with certainty. Ashley cleared her throat softly, as if preparing to say something, then hesitated, choosing instead to redirect her attention to the table, to the plates, to anything that allowed her to maintain the appearance of control, and I understood that instinct, because control is often more about perception than reality, especially when it has not yet been tested. I allowed a small breath to leave my chest, slow and measured, and then I reached into my purse, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm intention I had carried all afternoon, and as my fingers closed around the envelope, I felt that final line being crossed, the one that separates preparation from action. I placed the envelope on the table in front of me, not sliding it toward anyone, not drawing attention to it, simply setting it down as though it had always belonged there. And for a moment, no one spoke, because even without explanation, everyone understood that something had just entered the space that had not been there before. My son looked at it first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to read what it might mean, and Ashley followed his gaze, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly, the confidence softening just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. I kept my hands resting lightly beside the envelope, not touching it anymore, allowing it to exist on its own. Because the weight of it did not come from what it looked like, but from what it represented, and I had no need to rush that realization. I thought it might be a good time, I said quietly, my voice even, not raised, not strained, simply present in the space between us. And that was all I offered. No explanation, no justification, because I had learned that the less you say in moments like this, the more people are forced to confront what they already suspect. Ashley's eyes moved from the envelope back to me, searching, measuring, trying to regain ground that had shifted beneath her without warning. And I met her gaze steadily, not with challenge, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to counter, calm certainty, the kind that does not ask for permission and does not require approval. Around us, the room seemed to hold its breath, conversations fading, attention narrowing, and I realized that this, finally, was the moment they had not prepared for, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was controlled, deliberate, and entirely outside the narrative they had constructed. And as I sat there, waiting without urgency, I knew that whatever happened next would not be a reaction, it would be a consequence. I watched as the meaning of that simple object began to take shape in their minds, not all at once, but in small, quiet realizations that moved across their faces like shadows shifting with the light. My son leaned forward slightly, his hand hovering just above the table, as if he were deciding whether or not to reach for the envelope. But he stopped himself, choosing instead to look at me, searching for some signal, some reassurance that this was still within the bounds of what he understood. And I held his gaze with the same steady calm, offering him nothing but the truth of my presence. Ashley, on the other hand, did not look at me first. She looked at the envelope again, longer this time, her eyes tracing its edges, measuring its weight without touching it. And I could almost see the calculations forming behind her expression, the quiet attempt to regain control by anticipating what it might contain. "What is that?" she asked finally, her voice carefully even, but just a shade tighter than before, and I noticed how the room seemed to lean in slightly, how the casual noise that had filled the afternoon had now settled into a focused silence, everyone waiting, not for a dramatic reveal, but for an explanation that might restore the balance that had been disrupted. I allowed a brief pause before answering, not to create tension, but to respect the moment for what it was, a turning point that did not need to be rushed. And then I spoke, my tone gentle, almost conversational, as if we were discussing something ordinary. "It is simply something I wanted to share with you both." And I saw immediately that the simplicity of my answer unsettled Ashley more than anything else could have, because it gave her nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss. My son exhaled quietly, a breath he had been holding without realizing it. And this time he did reach forward, his fingers touching the edge of the envelope before lifting it slightly, turning it just enough to feel its weight. And I watched him carefully, not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet understanding, because I knew that whatever assumptions he had made before today were now beginning to shift. Ashley's eyes followed every movement, her posture straighter now, her attention fully fixed, no longer pretending that this was just another part of the afternoon. And I could see that she was trying to read my face, to find some clue that would tell her how to respond, but there was nothing there for her to interpret beyond what I had chosen to show, and that was intentional. "Go ahead," I said softly, nodding once toward the envelope, and my son hesitated for only a moment before opening it, the sound of paper sliding against paper unusually loud in the quiet room. And as he began to unfold the document inside, I noticed how his expression changed, not dramatically, but in subtle stages, curiosity giving way to confusion, then to something deeper, something more serious. Ashley leaned closer, unable to remain still any longer, her composure thinning as she tried to see what he was reading, and for the first time since she had raised her glass. Earlier, there was no performance in her face, only raw attention, and I understood that this was the point where perception and reality begin to separate, where assumptions meet something they cannot easily explain away. I remained seated exactly as I had been, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, because my role in this moment was not to dominate it, but to allow it to unfold fully, to give them the space to process what they were seeing without interference. My son looked up at me then, his eyes searching again, but this time not for reassurance, but for confirmation, and I met that look with a small, steady nod, not adding words, not interrupting his understanding, simply acknowledging that what he was reading was exactly what it appeared to be. Ashley's voice came next, softer now, less controlled. "What does this mean?" And I turned my gaze to her, holding it just long enough to make sure she felt the weight of the moment before I answered, not with confrontation, not with anger, but with clarity. "It means that things are not exactly the way you believe they were." And as the words settled into the silence, I could feel the shift complete, the quiet balance that had defined the afternoon replaced by something far more real, something that could not be undone or ignored. And in that stillness, I knew that everything that followed would come not from assumption, but from truth. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if every unspoken assumption in the room had suddenly found its voice without needing words. And I watched as my son looked back down at the document, reading more carefully now, his brow tightening slightly as the details settled into place, the kind of details that do not shout, but instead reshape everything quietly. Ashley leaned closer, no longer pretending distance. Her composure slipping just enough to reveal urgency, and I noticed how her hand moved toward the paper before stopping, as if she understood that touching it would make it more real than she was ready to accept. "This does not make sense," she said, her voice lower now, no longer carrying the polished confidence from earlier, and I let that statement sit for a moment before responding. Because confusion is often the first step toward clarity. My son turned another page, his movements slower, more deliberate, and I could see the shift happening in him. Not a sudden realization, but a gradual alignment with something he had not expected, something that required him to reconsider what he thought he knew. I remained exactly where I was, my hands resting calmly, my posture unchanged, because there was nothing left for me to prepare, nothing left to arrange. Everything that needed to be done had already been done long before today. "It is all there," I said gently, not directing the words at anyone in particular, but allowing them to exist in the space between us. Every decision, every detail, exactly as it should be. And I saw my son glance up again, this time with a different expression, not just searching, but understanding beginning to form. Ashley straightened slightly, her eyes moving between the document and my face, trying to reconcile the two, trying to find a version of events where this outcome did not exist. But reality has a way of remaining steady even when people wish it would shift. "When did you do this?" she asked, and there was something new in her tone now, not just uncertainty, but a hint of disbelief, as if the timing itself was a betrayal of what she had assumed. And I met her gaze evenly before answering. "Long before today," and I let that be enough, because the exact moment did not matter as much as the fact that it had already happened, beyond reach, beyond revision. My son lowered the papers slightly, his shoulders settling as the weight of understanding replaced the tension of uncertainty, and I could see that he was beginning to see the full picture, not just the document in his hands, but the intention behind it, the quiet decisions that had led to this moment. Ashley, however, remained caught in that space between expectation and reality, her expression shifting in small, controlled ways as she tried to regain footing, to reframe the situation in a way that gave her back some sense of control. But there are moments when control is not something you reclaim. It is something you realize you never truly had. "So what happens now?" my son asked, his voice steady but thoughtful, and I turned my attention to him, offering a small, reassuring nod, not because I needed to guide him, but because I recognized that he was ready to hear the answer. "Now," I said calmly, "everything continues exactly as it should, just with the truth in place." And as those words settled into the room, I felt a quiet sense of completion, not triumph, not vindication, but something steadier, something more grounded. The knowledge that I had not raised my voice, I had not forced the moment, I had simply allowed it to arrive, fully formed, undeniable. Ashley looked down once more at the document, her earlier confidence now replaced by careful consideration, and I knew that whatever she had believed before today had been altered in a way that could not be undone, not by argument, not by assumption. Because the truth, once seen, does not disappear. I sat there for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle around us. And then I reached forward gently, not to take the document back, but simply to rest my hand near it. A quiet reminder that while the paper held the details, the decision itself had always been mine. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations hesitantly returning, I understood that nothing outwardly dramatic had occurred, and yet everything had changed in the only way that truly matters, quietly, permanently, and entirely. On my terms.